Shalom. Welcome, beloved, to Grace and Truth Ministries on the Mr. Blacktastic channel. I am Brother Isaiah, also known as Yeshaya. I'm a born-again believer of Adonai Yeshua Mashiach, who is also known as the Lord Jesus Christ. I believe in the scriptures of the Holy Bible as the infallible testimony of Yah, and that Yeshua Mashiach is the only begotten Son of Yah who came into the world as a man by miraculous incarnation of the Holy Spirit to redeem lost humanity from sin. I fully believe Yeshua is both Lord and God according to the Holy Scriptures that declare he was manifested in the flesh, justified in the spirit, seen of angels, preached unto the Gentiles, believed on in the world, received up into glory, and that also say, for in him the whole fullness of deity, the Godhead, dwells bodily. This ministry is about salvation in Yeshua, to bring together Jew and Gentile believers as one in Christ to fulfill Scripture. I do not tolerate racism, bigotry, anti-Semitism, racial supremacy doctrines, nor those attitudes. It is my sincere prayer that through the Holy Spirit, I may serve as a prophetic voice to all in need of salvation through the gospel of Yeshua Mashiach, according to the Holy Scriptures. On this platform, I will be teaching scripture, history, and discussing relevant issues. I pray you receive insight, inspiration, and faith by the word of Yahweh in the name of Adonai Yeshua HaMashiach. So today's lesson, we're going to talk about the Trans-Saharan Slave Trade, an inconvenient truth, part number 1. So let me say shout out and greetings to some wonderful people that have joined us as always. My dearly beloved sister Shirley Greer, good to see you, beloved. My sister Denise Jones, what's going on? Trying to keep up with the Joneses. All right, my sister Regina, have you seen her? Have you seen Regina? Yep, we seen her. She in the chat. She right there, y'all. I see you. Good to see you. My sister Naomi. Naomi, good to see you. The priestess, Sister Naomi Levi or Levy. Good to see you, my sister. She has a you all, if y'all haven't come across her site, has a company that she started called I think it's Ajalon's Aroma. Now I don't want to mess up the name, so you're gonna have to type it in so I can put it on the screen. But I know it's got something to do with shea butter and some other moisturizers to keep you from being ashy, like them brothers from Africa had me when they sold me that lotion. They told me it was real shea butter, and it ended up saying made in Mexico on the bottom. Thomas, my brother, this is real from the motherland. It wasn't from no motherland, it was from Mexican. But she ain't gonna do that to you. All right. So y'all support her if you can. All right. I see my brother, son. Good to see you, my man. All right. Good to see you. All right. Let me see. So y'all make sure y'all support a sister that's not gonna sell you short. You won't be ashy like I was hours later, looking like I was wearing baby powder or eating powdered donuts all day long. So, so today we're gonna get into this Trans-Saharan slave trade. All right, and I have my brother with me on the screen with me, sharing the platform for the next two sessions. And my brother, the Orthodox Moore, man, go ahead and greet the people, my brother.
Peace. What it is, fam. Appreciate you bringing me on, brother, man.
Hey, man, appreciate you, brother, joining us, man, because I know you got some great information, man, to add to the presentation, and to all of those folks, because, we've been having some funny discussions. I've been having funny discussions with people on the phone and online. And, man, I guess I just learned recently that, I'm soft and I'm a chump because I turned my heat on. I didn't wait for it to get freezing cold. I couldn't hold out. So whatever, man. So that's what I've been told recently. I know you in the Pacific Northwest. I'm down here in Atlanta, man. Look, the temperature dropped. It got funny on us, y'all. When the temperature got down into them 40s and 30s, about a week and a half or so ago, bro, I had to click that heat switch, man. They were like, "Oh, you a chump. You couldn't hold out. You could have just put on more clothes." That's the problem. I did. It was still cold. So I wimped out, man.
Yeah, I do the same thing because when it gets that cold up here where I'm at, like it's a bone aching cold. I'm good with that. And shalom to everybody in the chat. Hey, yo, shout out.
Oh, y'all see Abu. What's going on, Abu? Good to see you, my man. So we gonna get into this, today. Since we got folks in the chat like Abu and different ones, if people want to add anything to the presentation as we go further, I may on Thursday. I probably will drop the link, just to get some extra information for people who want to participate. Because today we're gonna do a lot of video presentations, primarily just to kind of bring people up to speed. Like I said, I don't believe in reinventing the wheel. So wonderful people who have already done video presentations on certain parts of what we're going to show, they're going to present, and I'm going to show their videos, and we're going to discuss and commentate on these videos. Now on Thursday, today we're going to be more historical. On Thursday, we're going to be both historical and theological because we want to put these things in perspective, or look at it from a biblical perspective. But we want to go over some of the history. And one of the things is, we want to dispel some myths. So there's a lot of sacred cows out there that have to be barbecued, because if not, we're going to be walking on in a lot of dishonest information. And like my brother Yason said, it's good to see someone speaking about this slave trade. We only hear about the transatlantic slave trade. Exactly, my brother. And so we always hear about the transatlantic slave trade. And that's why, because people by default only care about what affects them directly for the most part. Now, if a geek like myself, like Moore, like Abu, like some of you all in the chat, Well, not only are you concerned about those things, you also want to know, other stories too. This is why I enjoy listening to people's testimonies and things of this sort. Why? Because you'd be surprised at how oftentimes those other histories that you don't think have anything to do to you are actually tied into the history you're more concerned with, because you think you're more closely tied to it. See, and then we start to talk about global dispersion. When we talk about the Israelite diaspora from a biblical perspective, well, if you only believe that Israelites were dispersed westward, into what we call the New World, which now encompasses the United States and the Americas and everything like that, then you don't even believe what the Bible actually says, because you're dismissing the fact that long before 70 AD occurred, in which the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and the temple and the transatlantic slave trade occurred, well, you see the northern kingdom that was the majority of the 10 tribes being carried off into captivity into the opposite direction. And then there's so much other history that happens in between that period of time and the time when the transatlantic slave trade does happen, or when 70 AD happens. For instance, you have Jews that will disperse throughout other empires, such as throughout the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire. They had colonies that were established even long before there was trouble on the horizon, and they begin to be taken into captivity. We believe that, based on information that's available, that there was a colony of Israelites in Spain, which was known as Iberia or Tarshish back then, as early as the time of Solomon. I've learned through doing my own research that there was a colony of Jews in Belgium. We're talking about around the time of Augustus Caesar, the first official emperor or Caesar of the Roman Empire. So, and Shirley says India as well. Yes, you had, so the people dispersed in all directions. And it's not always just because of key dates in history that people like to always go to, such as the transatlantic slave trade or the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The Jews had learned how to build communities in other places for when their homeland was destroyed. And then in many cases, a lot of people, when you look at the book of Acts, chapter 2, it says something very interesting, that when they begin to speak in tongues in other languages, they were speaking in tongues to other Jews, not foreigners. They were speaking in tongues to other Israelites who did not speak Hebrew or the native tongue, of the Jews, but they spoke as their first language those tongues or languages in the various countries and provinces from whence they were from and where they were born. They just came back to Jerusalem to honor the feast. But when they were not in Jerusalem or when they were abroad, they spoke all types of different dialects, because those were oftentimes their first languages. And most of the Israelites in the land at the Levant at that time, or what was known as Palestine under the Romans, and which we call it today, most of them were not liturgical Hebrew speakers, but they spoke Aramaic or Greek as their lingua franca, meaning the common tongue. So you have a lot of history and things that oftentimes gets embellished and overlooked. And then there's this also where it concerns Africa. There's this romanticization, I would say over romanticizing of Africa, as if it was this, black pearl of a utopia that Israelites flooded into or fled into, and existed in peace and harmony before European colonization. And it's just absolutely not true. And y'all see a lot of people now trying to pick up other cultures from a lot of the African tribes who make a claim to being descendants of Israel, such as the Igbo and different things of this sort, and Lemba and others. The Lemba we know for sure. The Igbo more recently were affirmed. But there's something that needs to also be pointed out. In trying to adopt these continental African cultures, it doesn't mean you're necessarily adopting a biblical Israelite culture, because over the thousands of years in which people have been displaced, if you go by the biblical narrative, then what you have to understand is that Israel was dispersed into these places as the minority. amongst groups of people. They were never the majority. The scripture even says that clearly in Deuteronomy 28, when it talks about how you're going to be small in number, which seems to be parts of the scriptures that people leave out, and they just jump right down to the end and go to verse 68, how you're going to be taken back into Egypt by ships. And they overlook that, and then they try to connect that to the transatlantic slave trade, when we actually have real history to connect that very occurrence to that prophecy, which actually did take place under Roman rule during the destruction of Jerusalem. But beyond that, again, you wouldn't go into all these countries like people like to oftentimes think, and unless you were just really a strong or strict type of purist, where you were just determined, like some were, to keep the culture, to keep the customs, to keep all the things that were given to you under Torah, more than likely you're going to start to adapt to the environment you're in and adopt a lot of the practices, the languages, and customs of the people around you, even if you know what your true lineage or history is. And you start identifying with those people, and you start using their terminology and their language. And then what we'll end up getting all these many years later is a bunch of shysters and charlatans and people who will be saying, oh, this language is the original Hebrew language. So you're going to hear Igbo is the original Hebrew language. It's not. You're going to hear Iwe is the original Hebrew language. It's not. You're going to hear people say Bambara is the original Hebrew language. It's not. And then you're going to have a slew of people, like you probably already heard, talk about Bantu this, Bantu that, and Bantu that. And and they don't even know what Bantu is. But there's not one tribe on the African continent that calls itself the Bantu tribe. Have you ever wondered why that is? The Bantu expansion and all of these other things do play a part in a lot of history. But what people have dwindled it down to or try to make it out to be is not always what they seem to think it is. The Bantu is a language family under which several million people have been classified that are diverse within and amongst themselves, that have split off into so many different tribes. There are over 660 different Bantu languages. And yet we hear people try to make the entirety of Bantu-speaking peoples the descendants of Israel. That would not coincide with scripture. Okay, because now you're talking about all of Southern Africa and the majority of Central Africa. But then at the same time, in people's confusion, they want to claim that they're Igbo, Yoruban, Hausa, Ashanti, Akanian, and these different things. Well, none of those people are Bantu. Those are Nigerian Congo people. So a lot of information that's being passed, in particular in the Black community, and amongst Israelites specifically, is bad information. A lot of it, again, I call it memeology, because a popular meme circulates, and that's where people take their information from, rather than just go to the library and read books, or go on Amazon or barnesandnoble.com and buy books, or ask people who are actually in the know that spend time studying these things to get some sound, solid information. So we're going to try to dispel a lot of these bad talking points and things that are being promoted and circulated and passed around. We don't know it all, but all that we know, we're willing to share. And we want to hear your questions and concerns, but we want to give you some quality information. Brother, you got anything you want to add to that?
No, I'm good right now. I think we can get into them clips and get into the commentary whenever you want to.
All right, we're going to definitely get there. So the first thing I'm going to do before we get into those clips, let's just define the word of slave, all right, biblically. And we're just going to look at the Hebrew definition instead of going into the Greek also, because the Greek definition is going to be based on also the Hebrew definition, all right? So in Strong's, wherever you see the term servant in most of your English translations that use the Masoretic text, such as your KJV, the word used there, or that servant is translated from, is ebed. Now, other translations that are more accurate and up to date, like the ESV and your NASB, are going to actually use the word slave in most cases. But it's the same, it's coming from the same Hebrew word. So the Hebrew word here is abed. All right, abed. And it basically from Strong's means a servant. All right. And then bondage, the X in the front, you got different types of bondage. You have bondman, you have bond servant, you have manservant. Brown Driver Briggs lexicon or dictionary gives us a little bit more of an expansion on the definition. And it says slave servant, manservant, subjects, servant, worshipers of God. So we're all, as servants of the Most High, we're all abed too. There's different types of servants or slaves. In other words, we're bonded to the Lord, but not under bondage to the Lord, but we're bonded to him by covenant in love. All right. Then you have servant in special sense as prophets, Levites, the priests, then servant of Israel. All right. And then servant as a form of address between equals. Now that's interesting because we're supposed to serve one another. So when even reading the scriptures, it's important to always take into account context. All right. As you heard people say, either context is key or context is king. So it's always important when you're reading the scripture and you see a word, even though it might be the same word used several times in different passages, the language or the intent of the conversation and the speaker as you're reading the scriptures may not always be the same. So the meaning is going to be relative to what is intended by the one speaking. But in this particular regard, we are talking about slaves, all right? Slavery, those taken against their will by force, becoming chattel slave or property of another. And so we're going to deal with that. I see my dear brother Aerospike and my good friend and brother Elder Isaac also joining us. Shalom to you all. So we're going to get right into it. To these video clips. We got some great video clips. And before we do that, I'm going to make sure I read the fair use disclaimer since we already got the banner going around along the bottom. It says fair use disclaimer and copyright notice. This presentation may contain copyrighted material of which the use has not been specifically authorized by the copyright owner. This material is being used and made available for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, or research, etc. This constitutes a fair use of any such copyrighted material as provided for in Section 107 of the U.S. Copyright Law in accordance with Title 17 U.S.C. Section 107. The material in this presentation is distributed without profit to those interested in this information for research and educational purposes. And I want to make sure we read that because you all remember the last time. Hold on, I didn't even show it. Let me make sure I show it. I read it, but I didn't show it. So there it is, the fair use disclaimer. Okay. So, and I talked to, you know what I did too? I just realized, y'all, I'm so goofy. I sat here and I did all that reading about what a slave was. And I had the slide the whole time thinking that I'm showing you guys the slide. But here's the slide. Okay. With the definitions on there. So y'all please charge it to my head and not to my heart. Sometimes I feel like a nut, sometimes I am a nut. And this time my nut was cracked. So there's the actual slide for the definition of slave. All right. So please forgive me for that because I totally forgot in going through the presentation. All right. So we already read the fair use disclaimer and copyright notice. So we're going to move on to the first video. And what I want to do here is I want to try to take you all systematically through the history of slavery going back further than the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade and even the trans-Saharan slave trade. All right. And because I want to go to the etymology of the word slave, which I don't think a lot of people actually even ask the question, where did that word come from? All right. And so we're going to look at Slavs. Yeah. Europeans. All right. Who were actually the first in what we now know as chattel slavery. Now understand, slavery has existed all the way back to before even biblical times. But we're going to look at the development of slavery into the modern era. And I want to start with this particular video. All right. And shalom to my brother Ophizi. Good to see you, my man. All right. So here we go.
Chattel slavery is defined as the enslaving and owning of human beings and their offspring as property, able to be bought, sold, and forced to work without wages, as distinguished from other systems of forced, unpaid, or low-wage labor also considered to be slavery. Was chattel slavery among the Africans by the Europeans unique? Which cultures enslaved the most people? Which cultures practiced slavery the longest? Which slave trade had the most slaves during their history? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, a veteran of the United States Army and Marine Corps, former history professor, book author, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. Many believe that European enslavement of Africans was unique and the largest slave trade in history. They use the term chattel slavery denoting the method in the United States specifically. This ignores the fact that this was not unique to the North American experience. South America also had the practice with the Spanish and Portuguese. Was it unique to the Europeans? History says no, and in fact this is a myth. Enslaving people in chains for forced labor, owning them as property, as well as their offspring, was practiced long before the European powers even first set foot in West Africa, and European Slavs were the primary targets for enslavement in Eastern and Central Europe for several thousand years by many empires. It is often believed that the word slave was derived from the Latin word for Slav as the Roman Republic and later the Empire expanded into Eastern Europe. Slavs were a primary target for their slave trade. In addition, the Slavs were themselves enslavers of others, to include Byzantine Greeks, as stated by historian Igor Froyanov. Many scholars believe that the word slave has its origins in Old Greek, leia meaning to plunder or taking booty, as well as conquer and take. There is also the Greek etymology for the word sklavos, being a derivation of sklabinos, which translates as Slavic, originally as a self-reference for the Slavic people, as Slavininu. However, Slavs had also been slaves of the ancient Macedonians and ancient Greeks, as well as the ancient Bulgars. Likewise, the Byzantine Empire that succeeded the Western Roman Empire also took Slavs as slaves, and therefore the word was used in the Greek lexicon. These slaves were in fact in generational servitude under the Byzantines, just as serfdom was also generational later throughout Europe. And these were Christians basically enslaving other Christians, but Muslims were prevented from enslaving other Muslims. But non-Muslims were fair game. The Romans took their slaves not just for agricultural labor, but also for brothels and for entertainment in the Colosseum starting in the 1st century AD. Many became gladiators, while many more were simply used as public entertainment and fed to wild animals. When the Huns arrived in Eastern Europe around 376 AD, and while not slavers as such, they did take hostages, and many of these were Slavs. Slavs, not being a unified people and just a collection of scattered peoples, were easy to conquer and enslave. The Moors from Spain and North Africa took Slavs into captivity during the 7th century and beyond. Otto the Great, in the 9th century, captured pagan Slavs and sold them into slavery. The Seljuk and Ottoman Turks used the same method against their African and European slaves. In fact, 20% of their populations were slaves. In the mid-14th century, Ottoman Sultan Murad I built an army of slaves, referred to as the Kapukulu. The Desvirme system allowed for promotion and advancement if they converted to Islam, such as within the Janissary Corps. Other slaves were kept for hard labor and basically worked to death. It is believed by many historians that Sultan Mehmed II established the first open commercial Ottoman slave market in Constantinople in the 1460s, following the model already used throughout Turkey, replacing the former Byzantine slave market. Historian Nicolas de Nicolay states that there were slaves of all ages and both sexes, often displayed naked, to be thoroughly checked, and this was true of children and young women for potential buyers. For 600 years, the Ottomans practiced the largest slave trade in history, and sometimes it was brutal. Historian Madeline C. Zilfi chronicles that under both Arab and Ottoman rule, black Africans were considered inferior to European and Caucasian slaves, and therefore less valuable, therefore expendable. Many slaves served on Ottoman ships, the oared galleys. Life was brutal and often short, as these slaves were not considered to be valuable, as they were easily replaced, unlike the black slaves from Africa who were considered quite valuable to the English, Portuguese, and Spanish colonial powers in particular. To the Muslims, they were almost worthless. But many people want to do a comparison between the Atlantic African slave trade and other forms of slavery. When it comes to sheer volume, the Arabic and Ottoman slave trades lasted 900 years longer and enslaved tens of millions more than the 13 to 14 million taken from Africa by the Europeans. More sub-Saharan Africans were sold to the Islamic world than to Europe and the Western Hemisphere combined. There were more Europeans enslaved by North Africans than there were sub-Saharan Africans enslaved and sent to the Western Hemisphere. This was slavery based upon race, so it was not created by Europeans. It was also based upon religion. Non-Muslims, as I said before, were targets. In fact, the Europeans were very late to the party and basically amateurs when it came to slavery. The Spanish and Portuguese were the most effective, taking over 90% of the Africans for their colonial empires starting in the mid-15th century. The English actively entered the slave trade over 100 years later. Millions of Muslim slaves were Slavic Christians, among many other Christian ethnic groups. However, what is of interest was that if Christians or other non-Muslim groups paid tribute, basically paying taxes or bribes, then this often prevented the taking of slaves in most cases. It was a protection racket. This was also true of the Ottomans for the most part, but not necessarily for the Arab cultures who still exacted tribute, but often still raided for slaves all over Europe and East and Central Africa, such as the East African and Barbary slave trades. Slavery for life was not unusual, and the children of slaves inherited that status in many cases. Punishments in their society ranged from impaling, flogging, burning, hanging, and beheading. All were normal punishments in Muslim culture, but for a slave to escape and to be recaptured or simply charged with a crime, these punishments, execution by any means, were standard procedures. This was mainly due to the vast numbers of potential slaves that cost nothing to acquire and were worked to death in various ways. Ottoman and Arab slavers took their slaves from territories they either raided or had conquered, requiring no expense for obtaining free labor. A century after the Western societies ended legal slavery, the Young Turks adopted an anti-slavery stance in the early 20th century. As stated by historians Clarence Smith and William Gervais, Sultan Abdul Hamid II's personal slaves were freed in 1909, but members of his dynasty were allowed to keep their slaves, and, finally, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk ended legal slavery in the Turkish Republic. However, Turkey waited until 1933 to ratify the 1926 League of Nations Convention on the Suppression of Slavery. Nonetheless, illegal sales of girls were reportedly continued at least into the early 1930s, and the legislation explicitly prohibiting slavery was not adopted until 1964. In other Muslim countries, slavery also lasted longer than in the West, with Saudi Arabia finally ending legal slavery in 1962. Legal slavery lasted in the Islamic world from the 6th century well into the 20th century. Muslim slavers operated from Europe, Africa, and Asia to the Indian Ocean, which involved hundreds of millions of people being slaves. Yes, Muslim slave trading was the greatest in history, and it still exists today, only it is not openly practiced nor endorsed by any government. Thank you for watching Forgotten History. Please click like, subscribe, and share. Send us comments and show ideas, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. Until next time.
All right. So if you notice there, some great points were made there. And let me say this also, too, because some people probably watch this, because I'm sure there are people that are watching that are not participating in the chat. Some of the folks who love to just what I call hate watch. They don't really like my channel or like me in particular, but they love to try to criticize and leave funny comments, which I don't know why you're wasting your time if you don't like being here. I don't know who keeps coming to a channel that they don't like, but if you're here, stick around because I hope you get some great information and get saved. If you got a problem with the presenters because of their skin color, that means that you're actually still in slavery because you're in slavery mentally. All right. The information, I went through these videos and I watched way more videos than what I'm going to present, but I selected the ones I did based on the fact that I thought those presentations were done without bias. There were some presentations by Black presenters that I deliberately avoided, not because I got something against my own people. That's just ridiculous and stupid, but it's because the information was being told from a biased perspective. And in order to get truth, sometimes you got to get it ugly, which because truth is not always convenient. That's why the subtitle for this is An Inconvenient Truth. And then there are Black presenters that I'm going to also share that give it to us raw and straight. There were also some white presenters that were very biased in trying to tone it down and, and make the Europeans look less burdened as if they weren't also guilty. And so I excluded those types of videos on purpose, again, because I wanted people that were going to give us the straight history without that bias or without those slants. And that's what we need, honest history and honest presentation, especially when we're dealing with history as it's connected to theology. You have to know the truth or you're just going to walk and live in a lie. So some very important things that he pointed out there. As you noted, the term Slavs or slaves came from the Slavs. And then you also see that not only were Blacks enslaved, but that whites were enslaved. But you see under the Turks and under the Arabs that you start to see the devaluing of people based on skin color. And they are even going to write books and things of this sort or circulate information to say as to why the Blacks in Africa or the slaves and things of this sort that they were taking were less valuable. But it didn't mean they actually thought highly of the white slaves they were taking. A slave was a slave, but they did have they did look at them based on certain differences they believed about the people, whether they were enslaved or not. And so a lot of modern day racism that we think all comes from Europe didn't all start in Europe. Other parts of the world also had forms of racism before we see it, spread globally by European cultures that existed amongst them. And racism has, like I said, the roots of it, in terms of it being instituted as a practice. Well, the beliefs that people had about other people existed before the institution of racism by European powers, which is somewhere around 600 years ago. But you already had people with these particular ideas about certain people, and they developed those ideas to actually justify the mistreatment of those peoples. So Arab and Ottoman or Muslim slave traders and others, and even African slave traders, were already doing it to people they were enslaved. Africans who phenotypically look the same for the most part, two Black people, well, they were also making that excuse and devaluing people based on what their tribal affiliation was. And you've seen this happen over periods of time in history where you've probably seen genocides and that sort of things take place, like what happened in Rwanda not that long ago. And it was because two people that on the outside looked physically the same, they had these tribal differences between them, and one decided that they were superior than the other and the other was inferior. And so this is where you get the genocide begin to happen, where they try to wipe each other, or one group tries to wipe the other out. And some of you all may have seen the movie Hotel Rwanda. Well, it's the same type of thing. So what we're seeing in our modern day, it has roots that go back further oftentimes than what we are aware of. And unless we dig and do the research, we won't know where all these things come from. Brother Moore, you want to say something?
No, I think that one's pretty succinct. Other than the fact that, something I definitely want to reiterate that dude was talking about was he was talking about the Moorish slavery, wasn't that right?
Mm-hmm.
I think people really just need to wrap their minds around it. I know you're talking about this too. Is literally like everybody's gone through slavery. Mm-hmm. Everybody's gone through it. It's not something that's just a unique thing to West Africans or whatnot, right? And the descendants thereof or whatnot. And so when you take a step back and start looking at like the slaveries people have gone through, and you really start comparing the contrast to the whatnot, it puts things in a different perspective and whatnot. Because most people always stipulate, well, oh, the transatlantic slave trade was the worst slave trade that ever happened in history, whatnot. And it's okay to say that, but have you done the comparison and contrast and whatnot, right? And that's not to be like, oh, people's suffering is more or less or whatnot, but there's an argument people put along with this, like, so like if the transatlantic slave trade was the worst one, then there's implications to that, et cetera, whatnot, right? So that's got to get walked out in a multitude of ways, right? Like, so A, is that true? And B, are the implications true, right? And C, like, are you trying to isolate yourself and not understand the suffering of others as well, right? Because, like, bro, there's slavery all over the place. There's slavery still going on in the world right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and you know, Ofizi brought it up in the chat. Libya, that's a known problem, and it's amazing to me how the news ignores the fact that the Libyans have been enslaved since Gaddafi was assassinated by Western powers. The Libyans have been enslaving Africans seeking to pass through Libya on their way to Europe.
100%.
You know, so
I actually got one of my channels shut down, challenging some major Muslims in the Dawa circle about that, in terms of like, why don't y'all use your zakat to go try to free some slaves over in Libya and whatnot? You know,
right. I mean, man, that's the thing, and that's why we doing this presentation, is we have to show people that, look, this slavery thing, number one, is older than what people think. I believe they probably started enslaving people as soon as they dispersed from the Tower of Babel, because you already had this system in place where, you know, under Nimrod, he was trying to conquer. What was he doing? He was a manhunter. He was a conqueror, you know. And if some of the ancient legends of like Gilgamesh and different people are actually based on Nimrod, where we get all these legendary figures, which are really it's a composite of one individual, well, what you find out is that these tyrant kings, which is actually what a Nephilim is, they enslave people. They put people under bondage. If you think about this, when you look in the annals of history and you see how great structures were often built, like the pyramids and other things, they were built on the backs of slaves, just like America and many of its structures, right? And just like how Egypt was enslaving, you know, the Jews. Well, think about this. How do you think some of these other things took place? Like, how did the Tower of Babel get built? He conquered people, enslaved them, and put them to work. You know, the Bible doesn't have to give us a slave narrative right there in Genesis chapter 11. All you got to do is look at the history of humanity. There was no ancient civilization that wasn't built without slavery. Babylon, Nineveh, Sumeria, any of those empires, Uz, which was an empire where Abraham came out of, Egypt, Ethiopia. Yeah, the place where a lot of folks trying to get y'all to run to and evacuate to. The Aksumite Empire. Those great Christian kings. The Negus Nagasti. Slavers. A lot of them were slaves. And slavery was officially declared over or abolished by the Muslim world in 1980. But again, notice the language that the people are using. They said it's officially, openly illegal. But most of the slavery being practiced is not open, is it? It means people do things illegally, you know, just like they did. And Ofizi asked the question, did slaves really build the pyramids? Yes, slaves were used to build the pyramids, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all the slaves used to build the pyramids were Hebrew slaves. Egypt conquered a lot of different peoples. Right? They even enslaved other Egyptians. And you even had divides in Egypt between the northern and southern kingdoms. They weren't always united. So, yeah, slaves were used to build those structures, but it just doesn't necessarily mean it was always Israelite slaves. They took slaves from a myriad of countries and other peoples that they conquered. All right. So, you know, yeah, slavery built a lot of things that we see as that we now celebrate as ancient monuments, you know, to human ingenuity. A lot of people died building that stuff. So the next video is about facts about slavery that are never mentioned in school. So let's take a look at this quick video.
The instrumental use of the history of slavery today also underlies the claim that slavery grew out of racism. For most of its long history, which includes most of the history of the human race, slavery was largely not the enslavement of racially different people, for the simple reason that only in recent centuries has either the technology or the wealth existed to go to another continent to get slaves and transport them en masse across an ocean. People were enslaved because they were vulnerable, not because of how they looked. The peoples of the Balkans were enslaved by fellow Europeans, as well as by the peoples of the Middle East, for at least 6 centuries before the first African was brought to the Western Hemisphere. Before the modern era, by and large, Europeans enslaved other Europeans, Asians enslaved other Asians, Africans enslaved other Africans, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Slavery was not based on race, much less on theories about race. Only relatively late in history did enslavement across racial lines occur on such a scale as to promote an ideology of racism that outlasted the institution of slavery itself. Wherever a separate people were enslaved, they were disdained or despised, whether they were different by country, religion, caste, race, or tribe. In East Africa, the Maasai were feared slave raiders, and other African tribes, either alone or in conjunction with Arabs, enslaved their more vulnerable neighbors. As late as 1891, it was reported that Manyuema slavers had demoralized surrounding tribes, destroying crops, and famine reigned everywhere. Even in the early 20th century, Abyssinians were still raiding other Africans and carrying off slaves. It was 1922 before the British had gained sufficient control in Tanganyika to stamp out slavery there. Arabs were the leading slave raiders in East Africa, ranging over an area larger than all of Europe. The total number of slaves exported from East Africa during the 19th century has been estimated to be at least 2 million. The form in which the story of slavery has reached most people today has been along the lines of the best-selling book and widely watched television miniseries Roots by Alex Haley. Challenged on the historical accuracy of Roots, Haley said, "I tried to give my people a myth to live by." This instrumental use of history, or purported history, is open to the same objections as other instrumental myth-making. Despite the impression created by Roots, during the era of the massive slave trade from West Africa, a white man was more likely to catch malaria in Africa than to catch slaves himself. The average life expectancy of a white man in the interior of sub-Saharan Africa at that time was less than 1 year. By and large, men from Europe or the Western Hemisphere came to the coasts of Africa, bought their slaves, and left as soon as possible. Even so, the death rates among the white crews of the ships carrying slaves to the Western Hemisphere were as high as the death rates among the slaves themselves. It was only much later, after quinine and other medical measures enabled Europeans to survive where there were tropical diseases, was it possible for them to invade Africa in force and establish empires there. But by then, the Atlantic slave trade had already been ended. During the era of that trade, Africa was largely ruled by Africans, who established the conditions under which slave sales took place. The crew of a slave ship was in no position to defy African rulers and their armies by going out across the land and capturing people willy-nilly. The stronger African peoples captured and enslaved the weaker peoples. The same pattern found over the centuries in Europe, Asia, the Western Hemisphere, and Polynesia. In Nyasaland, the Ngoni and Yao swaggered over and terrorized other tribes. In Uganda, the Baganda made life miserable for their neighbors. And the Nyoro and Hima of Anko enslaved Toro women and children. The Tutsi dominated the Hutu in Rwanda. The Maasai lorded it over the Kikuyu and Kamba. and the latter, in turn, held the Indorobo in a kind of serfdom. It was precisely the fact that Europeans, except for the Portuguese, seldom participated in the raids that captured and enslaved Africans that enabled most people in Europe and the Americas to remain oblivious to the traumatic experience that this was, with some Africans committing suicide to avoid capture and wives being whipped as they tried to cling to their husbands or children. Historian David Breon Davis pointed out that Europeans had little contact with the actual process of enslavement, and that as late as 1721, the Royal African Company asked its agents to investigate the modes of enslavement in the interior. Europeans typically saw only the end results, enslaved people being offered for sale on the coast. It was much the same story in the Ottoman Empire, where those who bought slaves had no idea what these slaves had been through before. The unique position of the Western world in the history, and especially the destruction of slavery, need not imply that there was unanimity within the West on this institution. In addition to whites who defended the enslavement of Africans on racial grounds, or who opposed general emancipation on social grounds, there were many whites, and even blacks, who defended slavery as a matter of self-interest as slave owners. Although most black owners of slaves in the United States were only nominal owners of members of their own families, there were thousands of other blacks in the antebellum South who were commercial slave owners, just like their white counterparts. An estimated 1/3 of the free persons of color in New Orleans were slave owners, and thousands of these slave owners volunteered to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Black slave owners were even more common in the Caribbean. In short, there were many defenders of slavery in the West, even in the 19th century. And outside the West, slavery was too widely accepted to require defense. No other nation ended slavery in the same way as the United States did, and few ended it after so short a struggle, as history is measured. How and why did slavery end in most of the world? There were two major processes. Over the centuries, as more and more territories around the world consolidated into nation-states with their own armies and navies, raiding those territories to capture and enslave the people who lived within them became more hazardous in itself, and also risked military retaliation against the countries from which the raiders came. Thus, more and more peoples became off-limits to slave raiders over time. Put differently, the areas which remained subject to slave raiding over the centuries were primarily those where the people lived in smaller or weaker societies. Such societies continued to exist where it was difficult, for geographic or other reasons, to consolidate large areas under one government. This was true of the Balkans, the backwaters of Asia, and much of sub-Saharan Africa. By the early modern era, sub-Saharan Africa, with its numerous and severe geographic handicaps, was one of the last remaining areas from which vast numbers of people could be enslaved.
Slavery was not unique to Africa or Africans, but was in fact common on every inhabited continent for thousands of years. As recently as the 18th century, it existed in Eastern Europe, and it continued to exist in the Middle East after the Second World War. What was unusual about Africa was the magnitude of the trade in human beings within recent centuries. Within Africa itself, slaves were used for a wide variety of tasks and under a wide variety of social arrangements. The classic plantation slavery of the Western Hemisphere was much less common in sub-Saharan Africa, and some of the forms of slavery shaded off into paternalistic incorporation of slaves into extended kinship with the slave-owning family, leading some to question whether this should be classified as slavery. However, such paternalistic arrangements were at one end of a spectrum that included brutal subjugation and even using slaves as human sacrifices. In some parts of Africa, such as Egypt, the Sudan, and Zanzibar, Africans were in fact plantation slaves on a large scale. Even where they were not plantation slaves, however, they often nevertheless lived separately from the free population, rather than in the kinds of paternalistic domestic living arrangements that existed elsewhere. In these other non-domestic occupations, mortality rates could be very high, as in Tanganyika and Zaire. The proportions of slaves in the general population varied, ranging from a minority to a majority even in a given region, such as the Sudan or Nigeria. Most African slaves remained in Africa. Indeed, those captured in the Sudan remained in the Sudan, and those captured in Nigeria remained in Nigeria. But the numbers exported were still enormous. In the middle of the 16th century, the total number of slaves exported from Africa was between 10,000 and 20,000 annually. 2 centuries later, the number peaked at about 100,000 annually. Origins and destinations of slaves also changed dramatically. The bulk of the mid-16th century slaves were exported from the northern Savannah and the Horn of Africa, but sometime after the middle of the 17th century, the west coast of Africa became the principal supplier of slaves, a position it was to hold for another 100 years, as the European demand for slaves in the Western Hemisphere overtook the demand for slaves in the Islamic countries of the Middle East and North Africa. The magnitude of the slave exports from Africa is particularly striking in view of the relatively thin population of the continent then, as now. The population of West Africa, where most of the Western Hemisphere slaves originated, has been estimated as about 11 million people at the beginning of the 16th century, increasing to about 20 million by the beginning of the 19th century. In some parts of Africa, such as the region of Angola and the Congo, enslavement was on a scale that exceeded the natural increase of population and resulted in depopulations of villages. In addition, the massive movements of captured people overland entailed a spread of disease. Cholera and smallpox, for example, followed the routes of the slave trade in East Africa. Markets for food and other provisions for the slave trade also grew up along its routes. The Arabs took more women than men, partly to fill the harems of the Ottoman Empire and other Islamic lands, so that the societies left in the African savannah tended to have an excess of men and children. The Atlantic slave trade took more men than women, using slaves principally for plantation labor, so that the West African societies from which slaves were taken had an excess of women and children. In both places, the resulting sex imbalance in African societies led to a revision of traditional sex roles, including an increase of polygyny in West Africa. In both areas, slaves were mostly young adults, so that the slave populations were atypical of the general African population, nearly 1/2 of which consisted of children. By the time the Europeans discovered the Western Hemisphere at the end of the 15th century, Moslem merchants already dominated the slave trade in West Africa, as they did in East Africa and North Africa. The Islamic jihads of the 18th and 19th centuries created new Moslem states in West Africa, which in turn promoted enslavement on a larger scale. Altogether, between 1650 and 1850, at least 5 million slaves were shipped from West Africa alone. Inland tribes, such as the Igbo, were regularly raided by their more powerful coastal neighbors, and the captives led away to be sold as slaves. European merchants who came to buy slaves in West Africa were confined by rulers in these countries to a few coastal ports, where Africans could bring slaves and trade as a cartel in order to get higher prices. Hundreds of miles farther south, in the Portuguese colony of Angola, hundreds of thousands of Africans likewise carried out the initial captures, enslavement, and slave trading processes, funneling the slaves into the major marketplaces where the Portuguese took charge of them and shipped them off to Brazil. Most of the slaves shipped across the Atlantic were purchased rather than captured by Europeans. Arabs, however, captured their own slaves and penetrated far deeper into Africa than Europeans dared venture before the era of modern medicine provided the latter with some protection against the fatal tropical diseases for which they lacked biological resistance. Over the centuries, untold millions of human beings from sub-Saharan Africa were transported in captivity to other parts of the world. No exact statistics exist covering all sources and all destinations, and scholarly estimates vary. However, over the centuries, somewhere in the neighborhood of 11 million people were shipped across the Atlantic as slaves, and another 14 million African slaves were sent to the Islamic nations of the Middle East and North Africa. On both routes, many died in transit. Moreover, these 25 million people were not the only African victims of slavery, for Africa itself used large numbers of slaves in many agricultural, domestic, military, and even commercial and governmental enterprises. The sum total of all the human beings who fell victim to the institution of slavery will never be known, even for Africa, much less for the world in general. The ending of the slave trade was one of many European policies imposed upon Africa by the conquerors. This did not mean the immediate freeing of existing slaves. Simply stopping the trading of slaves was itself a monumental undertaking, lasting for at least a century. As for the freeing of existing slaves, resistance and evasion by Africans, and especially by Arabs, made this a much more protracted process in Africa and the Middle East than in the Western Hemisphere. The very phrases used in these different parts of the world reflect their very different histories. While emancipation was usually a specific event at a specific time in the countries of the Western Hemisphere, the decline of slavery was a much longer and more uneven process in Africa, where slaves were still widely held in the early decades of the 20th century. In some Islamic countries in Africa and the Middle East, slavery lasted even longer. Saudi Arabia, Mauritania, and the Sudan continued to hold slaves on past the middle of the 20th century. Mauritania officially abolished slavery in 1980, though its own government admitted that the practice continued nevertheless. Indeed, Mauritanian government officials themselves have been implicated, and, more than a decade later, 30,000 black Africans were still being held as slaves in Mauritania, often under brutal conditions. On a smaller scale, slavery persisted in some other African countries on the eve of the 21st century. In one of the backwaters of Ghana, under local customs, some offenses required restitution in the form of turning over a virgin from the offending family to be a sex slave. Estimates of the number of girls involved run into the thousands. Commercial exploitation of young slaves also had not died out completely as a new millennium approached. Trading in children is a common practice in both Benin and Nigeria, the New York Times reported in August 1997.
So those videos show, as my brother Moore had said earlier, nobody's hands are clean. And I think the tendency for especially those of us in the Western Hemisphere, in particular blacks in the United States, is we think that slavery is oftentimes a one-sided thing, of that's how we tell the tale. White people brutalized black people, built America, built their economy, and things of this sort. And that is true to a great extent, but it's not the only truth. So we want to try to tell as much of the truth as possible, because again, that story is only told from the transatlantic slave trade perspective. And the whites, as we've already heard from the video, were the last to get in on the slave trade as it was when it was originally set up 700 years before their involvement under Muslim conquerors, actually about 900 years before. And so even to this day, like we said, where slavery may not be practiced openly, but that doesn't mean it isn't still being practiced. When they say it's not being practiced openly, that simply means there's no nation that sanctions it nationally by law. Yet, in many of these countries, it is still practiced. They would just publicly say, we don't practice slavery. Well, we don't legislate slavery here, yet the people are still practicing. And you still have that issue in both Libya and Mauritania. And we saw, as he was going off, talking about even in Ghana, as well as in Nigeria and Benin. But guess what? If you go on Amazon.com, you'll find a documentary where there's modern day slavery being practiced here in the United States. Yeah, they talk about out in the backwoods and places that people don't often venture into. But in Mississippi, not that long ago, there was a family still being held in slavery. And they had to go down there and free these people. And so you never know where else this may be taking place or happening. Right here in your own backyard in the United States. Yeah, the good old US of A. these practices happen. And then think about this also. Legally, your inmates that are locked away in the penal system are basically considered slaves. All right. And that's legislated in the Constitution. So you have, like I said, all these various things. But again, one of the points that was made that I don't want people to forget is that it was not possible for whites to go deep into the interiors of Africa to capture the amount of people that were actually sold to them, because of the fact that they were susceptible to malaria and other diseases that they didn't have the immunity for. You don't see until after they developed vaccines and things in the 19th century, meaning the 1800s, that they become more aggressive with trying to occupy territory. And that's where you're going to start to get things like the Balfour Agreement and all these other things. Well, now the great land scramble for Africa begins, because now they've been immunized and built up to be able to go in there deeper and not just be on the coastal regions and areas, to be able to occupy the land and actually live there. Not just take people and displace them from there or enslave them there in their territory. So these are things that aren't often considered when we take a look at the history. And then far too often, every now and then you get somebody make an angry rant and say, well, they sold us, or Africa did this, that, and the other. But oftentimes Africa is given a pass. And so we don't look at it honestly. We don't look at it honestly. And so what we want to do again is present factual information so that we can have an honest look at these historical events without sugarcoating anything. All right. There's no way that I can of myself, or even my brother Moore, try to make slavery look more humane. All right. Even in scripture, you don't see where the Lord institutes the practice of slavery. But when he realizes how far gone humanity is, he gives Israel some laws to help govern it until they can break away from it and stop the practice altogether. And you actually see that play out in scripture. But let's take a look at another video, that talks about exposing Africa's part in the slave trade. And again, this is not to make you mad, but some things may hit you emotionally, because I know it gets to me too at times, but it's to give you information so that you're more informed. And Brother Kedrick made a good point, about all of the missing kids. Yeah, because it's easier to control a child than it is an adult. And then you can keep the child for a lot longer, and so human trafficking, they're making a lot of money. You all heard about that sex ring that was broke up somewhere around a couple Super Bowls ago. And it was right here in the United States. So all of these different things, that are taking place all around us. So let's take a look at this video, and Brother Moore and I may stop this video at times to pause it so that to make commentary. But this was a little bit longer than the others, but let's take a quick look at it.
In many different forms throughout history, the reduction of another human being to the status of property used for labor at the command of another has been a feature of almost every society on Earth until the 19th century or so. No system of slavery has attracted more attention than the transatlantic slave trade, established by Europeans to provide slave labor for their American colonies. Around 12 million souls were taken from Africa and forced onto perilous journeys across the Atlantic, where they and their descendants were condemned to a life of servitude. However, retellings of the horrors of Atlantic slavery too often turn into stories of how Europeans alone determined the course of that history. In reality, Africans were not just passive victims. Millions of them were slaves, but many others profited from, produced, and protected that slave trade. In this video, we look at the untold story of the African slave trade. Stick around until the end to learn how some of Africa's greatest kingdoms were built on the profits of slavery, and how Africans fought tooth and nail to protect it from the abolitionist European empires. Slavery has existed in Africa for as long as recorded history. Ancient Egypt had slaves toiling away in its fields and on its monuments. Ancient Carthage trafficked in slaves across the Mediterranean, and the Ethiopian kings of Aksum wrote proudly of the slaves they took in war. Slaves were also exported from Africa for centuries before Europeans arrived. The Trans-Saharan Slave Trade lasted for over 1,000 years and dragged about 10 million people across the desert to be slaves in the Islamic world. The Indian Ocean also had a similarly long-lasting ocean-going slave trade, with about 5 million ending up in slave ships, bound and branded for use in foreign lands. These slaves ended up as laborers, domestic servants, soldiers, or more. Male slaves in the Islamic world were typically castrated, which meant that new slaves had to be regularly imported to maintain the population. For this video, we'll focus on Western Africa, where the Atlantic slave trade was centered. West Africa was removed from the Indian Ocean trade and mostly secure from Islamic slave raids, but slavery was still a feature of life there long before the Atlantic slave trade began. A succession of powerful empires occupied the region, which all rested on complex slave systems. The Ghanaian Empire from the 3rd to the 13th century began a tradition of powerful West African imperial states, and built much of its wealth through trans-Saharan trading of slaves or goods acquired through slave labor. The salt, copper, and gold that made the Mali Empire and Mansa Musa fabulously wealthy were all extracted with slave labor. Domestic slavery was also common, and Mali was known to import female slaves from the Mediterranean to act as domestic servants in the households of the elites. Most of the slaves were acquired through conquest of neighboring kingdoms, or tribal groups who were too weak to defend themselves from the organized imperial militaries. Successor empires like the Songhay, Jollof, and Kabu inherited the social and economic structures of slavery and continued to acquire slaves as they scrambled to establish their own territories. Elites in these empires used slaves as a status symbol, and ownership of slaves came to represent someone's wealth and power. Slavery took many different forms in West Africa. Some worked the land or the mines, others served as soldiers or even political advisors. In some places, slaves were permitted to own land that they cultivated in their free time and might earn enough from this land to buy their own freedom. In other places, the lot of slaves was more miserable. In Benin, for example, slaves were regularly sacrificed to mark important occasions like the anniversary of a king's death. All of this is to say that when Europeans arrived, they did not find an empty land of scattered peoples ripe for enslavement, but complex societies and slave-holding empires whose roots were even older than those of the Europeans themselves. The Atlantic slave trade was started by the Portuguese in the mid-15th century. Originally, slaves were taken to Europe, but this changed in 1526, when the first Portuguese ships carried slaves across the Atlantic to their new American colonies. However, the vision of Europeans landing on an African shore, frightening a tribe of natives into submission, and dragging them in chains to their ship is not representative of what happened for most slaves. Some slaves were indeed taken in European slave raids, but the vast majority was sold to the Europeans by other Africans. The European arrival in West Africa came at the same time as the collapse of the Mali Empire. Various splinter states scrambled over each other to seize territory for themselves. The Europeans with their firearms offered these competing rulers a potential advantage over their enemies. In turn, the huge amounts of captives that these kingdoms acquired in their wars were useful currency to trade with the Europeans. Additionally, the other goods like cloth and ceramics that the Europeans brought were status symbols that the new African elite could use to showcase their wealth and power. Different peoples responded in different ways to the opportunities of European slave trading. The Kingdom of Congo made contact with Portuguese explorers in 1483 and traded thousands of slaves every year. The slaving relationship between the two powers was sophisticated and mutually beneficial. For example, Congolese King Alfonso I saw the Portuguese as a useful outlet for the excess slaves he acquired during his expansionary wars, and he was an eager participant in slave trading. However, he also asserted his own power over it in 1526 by forcing Portugal to submit to his legal framework for slavery, which governed how exactly someone might be enslaved, and provided protections for those who were not legitimately enslaved, mostly his own subjects taken by criminal raiders or opportunists. A similar enthusiasm was seen among the various Akan peoples of modern Nigeria. They occupied an area known as the Gold Coast and were similarly prolific as both sellers and purchasers of slave labor. The gold mines that made the Akan so wealthy in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries were filled by slaves they purchased from both African and European merchants. As many as a third of the population of the various Akan states were enslaved people. In almost every case, these slaves were from non-Akan ethnic groups. Any sense of African solidarity in the face of European slave trading was almost non-existent. The ethnic divides that split Africa were far older than European contact. It would not be quickly changed by the arrival of foreigners on their shores. There was, of course, resistance. Many European slave ships were attacked by coastal raiders, but these reactions were rare and relatively ineffective. Most of the time, these were small-scale attacks by small tribes, or villages near where the Europeans dropped anchor. It was these tiny, disconnected groups who were most vulnerable to slavery, and their shows of defiance rarely saved them in the end. One state that did turn against European slaving was the Kingdom of Benin. The Kingdom of Benin was not the Benin we know today, but a small territory in modern-day Nigeria. Initially a partner in slave trading, by the mid-16th century, the kingdom was facing a serious drain on population, especially among its men. Two rulers, Oba Esigie and Oba Orhobuga, are credited with ending Benin's participation in Atlantic slave trading and closed Benin's ports to European traders. Slavery was not abolished in the country. In fact, the Kingdom of Benin would fight to uphold domestic slavery against Britain in the late 19th century. But this kingdom shows that Africans responded in many different ways to slavery. Each kingdom and ethnic group assessed their own situations and reacted accordingly, whether that was to sell slaves or prohibit it as they saw fit. Of all the slaving states of Africa, none is more infamous than Dahomey. First emerging around 1600 along the southern coast of modern-day Nigeria, Dahomey soared to prominence under the warrior king Agaja in the early 18th century. Dahomey's ace in the hole was a well-trained and well-organized standing army, perhaps as large as 50,000 men or more at its height, which Agaja used to conquer the kingdoms of Alada and Ouida in the 1720s. Alada and Ouida were prolific slave trading kingdoms, with tens of thousands of slaves passing through their ports. Dahomey's consolidated control of so many slave ports made it one of the most formidable slaving powers in history. The colossal army pushed Dahomey towards slavery for two additional reasons. Firstly, its military culture discouraged men from non-military careers, meaning that slaves were needed to carry out other jobs like agriculture. Secondly, a standing army had to be kept occupied or else it might grow restless and rebel. So Dahomey was constantly attacking other neighboring powers or sending out slave raids to bring back captives. The result was a colossal slave population. According to some estimates, by the 19th century, 2/3 of the kingdom's population were enslaved people. Slavery was so endemic to Dahomeyan society that one scholar remarked it's difficult to determine whether Dahomey was a slaving gang turned into a state or a state that existed purely for the sake of slaving. Slaves weren't just laborers and domestic servants in Dahomey, but became woven into the political fabric of the society. Ownership of slaves became a status symbol for Dahomeyan elites, as it did for others in West Africa. This led to tension between the king and the elites who fought for control over the slave trade. Although it is often characterized as a royal monopoly, even the absolute power of the monarch was not enough to rein in elites who established power bases of their own thanks to their trading of slaves. Slaves also became a part of Dahomean religion. The annual customs of Dahomey were a day of rituals and public celebration involving military parades, political debates, and human sacrifice of slaves to appease the spirits and protect the kingdom for another year. Hundreds of slaves were killed, usually with decapitation, and in some years as many as 4,000 people were sacrificed on a single day. A similar display of mass sacrifice was required for the funeral of a king, and might occur on a smaller scale for any number of other rituals or social events. Dahomey remained committed to slavery even as the European powers began their crusade against it. In 1818, King Gezo was forced to make concessions to the British, including the abolition of slave sacrifices, and by the 1840s, Gezo was being pressured to end the slave trade altogether, but he refused. "The slave trade is the ruling principle of my people," Gezo told the British. "It is the source and glory of their wealth. The mother lulls the child to sleep with notes of triumph over an enemy reduced to slavery." When the British managed to force a treaty on Gezo that ended slave trading from Dahomey's ports, it was a source of bitter resentment. The Dahomeans subverted it by selling slaves overland to be sold through ports not bound by the treaty's terms. Eventually, the resentment caused a total breakdown of relations, and Dahomey abandoned the treaty entirely by the late 1850s. They pivoted towards an alliance with France, who were less zealous in their anti-slavery attitudes, but the collapse of the slave trade would soon bring down the kingdom. As the kingdom's main source of wealth failed, it was forced into desperate raiding and conquest that antagonized the French. After attacking a French allied town in 1889, France waged 2 wars against Dahomey, citing its penchant for slavery as a legitimizing moral cause, and toppled the kingdom in 1894. A common misconception about European imperialism in Africa is that colonization and slavery always worked hand in hand. The Europeans set down their claims in Africa to furnish their endless desire for slaves. This was true at certain times. Portugal's colonies, such as those in Angola, were an important source of slaves. By the late 1700s, Portugal's thirst for able-bodied male slaves to work their American plantations meant that Angolan women outnumbered men in their homeland by at least 2 to 1. However, the vast majority of European colonization in Africa occurred after the abolition of slavery. It would be more accurate to say that anti-slavery motivated European colonization. We have already seen how France conquered Dahomey in part to end its slave trading. A similarly hard line against slavery was taken by the British. For example, in 1851, the Royal Navy lay siege to the Nigerian city of Lagos and its king Costco because the king refused to end the slave trade. After a furious naval bombardment, the British compelled Lagos to abolish the trade, forcibly freed every slave in Lagos's territory, and expelled all slave traders from their land. The British later imposed abolition on all of Nigeria. Some historians have noted that while Britain was quick to abolish trading, domestic slavery took a lot longer to root out in Nigeria. The British were concerned that moving too quickly to end slavery there would provoke unrest and resistance from the Nigerians themselves. Abolitionism was similarly evident in the British conquest of Benin in 1897. After the massacre of a British merchant expedition in January of that year, the British launched a punitive military strike against Benin City. Slavery was once again among the justifying causes of the attack and subsequent colonization of the kingdom. According to eyewitness accounts, the king of Benin sacrificed hundreds of its slaves in hopes hopes of acquiring divine protections against the approaching British. The British repopulated the decimated city with freed slaves and offered total emancipation and resettlement to any slave who escaped to their territory. Benin's elites were slow to embrace the change, and British authorities were still trying to stamp out native slavery there into the 1920s. That is not to say that there weren't African abolitionists. There certainly were, not least of all the slaves themselves. But there were many in Africa willing to fight and die to uphold the ancient institution. No discussion of slavery should ever gloss over the fact that millions of Africans suffered unspeakable cruelty across the Atlantic, Indian Ocean, the Sahara, or in Africa itself. The scale of the deportations from Africa deserves unique attention, but that suffering was not solely the product of foreigners imposing themselves on a passive continent. Africans were active in their own history and helped to create, expand, and uphold the systems of slavery that shackled other Africans. The story of Africa's support for slavery is as much a part of its history as its being a victim of it. While the experiences of millions of African slaves deserves all the attention it gets, that doesn't mean we should pretend that other Africans were not traders, raiders, and rulers who facilitated the enslavement of others on their continent. Africa was not uniquely guilty or innocent of slavery, but part of a shared human story of suffering, exploitation, and eventually abolition. Telling that history gets us closer to the truth and puts African history in its rightful place in world history, as a continent full of people who are as complicated and flawed as anyone else. If you appreciated this dive into the untold parts of African slavery, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more historical content like this.
All right. So, what did y'all think of the information you just heard? Quite eye-opening, isn't it?
I think there's a lot of jaws still on the floor right now.
Yeah, I can imagine. Because I know my jaw was on the floor as I began to keep going through a lot of this information. Because it's shocking, it's heartbreaking. I mean, it's definitely eye-opening because we see that, and this wasn't just the problem of one particular group of people who had a racist hatred for another people, but this was a human problem that we can trace back again through the ultimate culprit, which is the sin of humanity. In our rebellion against God, look at what we've done to one another. Mankind was told in the garden to have dominion over the earth, not dominion over each other. And slavery breaks that first instruction or edict, that first Torah, because that's what Torah is, instructions. The Lord never instructed us to dominate each other, to dominate our environment, dominate our world. Why? So we can live with each other. But slavery is a result of fallen humanity. And it shows us just how far that we've fallen, in that it has such a long history, and I'm careful to use the word rich history because only certain people got rich off the labor of other people. And there were oppressors of every nation, of every color. It wasn't just as simple as, when we look at the three sons of Noah, it's not just as simple as Hamites sold Shemites, or Shemites sold Yaphites, or Yaphites sold Hamites. These groups, many of them who were capturing one another and selling the other group into slavery, well, they probably traced back to the same son out of Noah's three sons. So you had Hamites selling Hamites, Shemites selling Shemites, and Yaphites selling Yaphites. because they weren't thinking about all of those particular distinctions going back that far. They were thinking oftentimes about tribal distinctions, but there were other ways that people oftentimes became slaves, and it wasn't just because they were foreign people from another tribe who were captured out of war. Sometimes people went into debt and other things of this sort. And as they mentioned more than one time, people also were stolen or abducted. And that shouldn't be hard for us to believe, because people are being stolen and abducted today. All right. And prophetically speaking, ask, can you provide any peer-reviewed articles that we can reference? This is very interesting. I would like to delve deeper into research. Thanks for sharing another perspective. You know what? I do have to put the links to these videos in the description after we finish here. And I do actually have some papers as well that I haven't read from yet, but I will read. And so I'll try to provide that information for you. All right. And you all can also email me if you have any questions about any of the information presented here. And I'll see what I can do about making any of that available to you as well. But there's a lot of information out there. I actually let me take that off. It's not top 3. It's actually top, because I was just going to do the the top 10. I mean, just the top 3, but that actually should read top 10. All right, that's top 10 tribes, not top 3. I was doing the top 3, and I decided to go ahead and put all 10 of them there. All right, but that's actually the top 10 tribes taken in the slave trade, and that's in the list from greatest to least. So number 1 is the transatlantic slave trade is the Mbundu, which are in Angola, and the Portuguese. That's where they sent a lot of that's where they had most of their colonies, and eventually most of those people would find their way to Brazil or South America. And then you have, interestingly enough, these would be the 2 groups that most Black Americans here, I would probably say the numbers 2 through 9 are going to be the ones that most Black Americans are going to be most closely related to. All right. Especially numbers 2 and 3, because of the high rate in which they were taken. But both the Yoruba and the Igbo, who ironically were enemies of the Fon, who were the people of the Dahomey Kingdom. A lot of the Fon's slaves or people that they captured were either Yoruban or they were Igbos. And so a lot of you may have descent from Yoruban persons or Igbos. I know that I do have at least one Yoruban ancestor. And then you have the Bakongo. And then, of course, you have the Fon, which is interesting that the Fon of Dahomey, who were some of the biggest slave traders on the West, end up becoming victims of slavery themselves. The Mande, from which some of you probably heard the term Mandinka or Mandingos, which is actually a corruption of Mandinka or Mande, but those people in Ivory Coast, the Fulani, which are one of the largest groups in Africa, and they're also in Nigeria and in other places, the Abron, and then you have the Wolof, and then you have the Chamba. So these are going to be your 10 top tribes taken in the transatlantic slave trade. But remember, we're doing the Trans-Saharan Slave Trade. But why did we start off this way? Because I want to show you what the connection is, because I want you to understand the Trans-Saharan Slave Trade is older than the transatlantic slave trade. So one of them came from the other.
And existed longer. Like, so, like it's older and existed after the transatlantic slave trade ended. People got to remember that. But go ahead.
Exactly. No, you hit it right on the nail, man. Jump anytime. Because one of the things they pointed out was when the Dahomey could no longer trade with the British westward, what did they do? They went to the opposite direction.
Eastward. I know you didn't come on here and have the nerve to play a video telling folks that the white man came to West Africa freeing slaves.
The white man went to Africa and stopped the slave trade. Now that don't mean he showed up like Santa Claus because he took
for sure. Anyway. The point is like people don't understand it. They're like what you showed was people consistently like so there was kings and this is the interesting part. Like so if you put up that list of 10 tribes again and whatnot, right? You're gonna see people that come from 3 main areas, right? People coming from Angola, people coming from like the Senegambia, Western Sahel, and then people coming from like Ghana, Ethiopia, or Ghana, Nigeria, whatnot, right? And so what's interesting about that, so like you're talking about the Fon, the Mende, the Fulani, the Wolof, like all of them were dealing with slave trading and whatnot, right? And what's interesting about all of them is at one point, like the thing was so prevalent and popular, and that's how they knew that's how they made their money. They eventually, like when they couldn't sell them, like when they couldn't get anyone else, they started selling their own people and whatnot. So like they're like these are slavers that ended up getting enslaved and whatnot. You know what I'm saying? And so what's interesting about that is that people want to assume that all of this slavery was done by the Muslims and whatnot. But no. Muslims make up like a third of that list. They make up like a third of that list. And so what you were seeing was that a lot of this slavery came from non-Muslims and whatnot, from them good old Bantu people, Niger Congo people that y'all, you know what I'm saying, like the non-Muslim people, you know what I'm saying? Like, so no. This was slavery all the way around, right? And I hope people heard the fact that like there were slaves getting sacrificed. I hope people heard that, right?
And that wouldn't be Muslim or Christian doing that. Those are African spiritualists.
Nope, exactly. And on top of that, like, so we have people talking about like, oh, they threw us like they threw our babies to gators and all kind of like we went through it. Like, yes, we went through horrible stuff here. Yes, lynched, raped, killed, murdered, stamped, all kind of stuff. All the crazy stuff you want to hear about like babies getting cut out from bellies, people getting tied up to horses and dragged for like all the crazy. Yes, 100%. All the stuff about people like, you know what I'm saying, like bringing like even kids to go watch people getting lynched or whatnot. All that. Yes. All that happened. Can you give me one story of 4,000 slaves getting sacrificed to somebody's God?
It's crazy, man. It's crazy. 4,000 in one day.
In one day, fam.
One day.
Like,
and then remember, they also said
go.
They sacrificed slaves when the king died too.
Right. Yeah, they might bury the slaves with the king or whatnot. You know what I'm saying? Like, so, man, but so think about that. A portion of your slave trade is specifically cut out for sacrifice. Think about that. Not like slaves that didn't make it to the destination. Yeah, that happened everywhere, right? That happened in the Trans-Saharan and the Transatlantic. I'm talking about specifically. You're buying slaves that you know ahead of time. I'm going to sacrifice 10% of these slaves right here. You know what I'm saying? Like, do you know what I'm saying? Like, it's specific cutout of your slave trade. We didn't know about that, fam. That's not what we went through. We went through chattel slavery, right? But before we went through chattel slavery, we was going through that. That's the whole crazy part. Sister in the chat was saying, I wonder we're so messed up. Yeah, the trauma goes deep and it goes back centuries or whatnot. And it's not, we can't just put this all on, oh, the evil European who instituted the worst slavery ever. Fam, man, here's a cold question, right? Gun to your head, which one would you prefer to be in? Trans-Saharan Slave Trade, Trans-Saharan Slave Trade? I'll let y'all answer
that. Bruh, I mean, just like you said, you either picking death by a tiger or picking death by a lion.
So they're talking about in the Trans-Saharan, they were focusing on women, right? And if you were male, you were likely to get castrated or whatnot, right? In the Trans-Atlantic slave trade, they were mainly focusing on the men, and they weren't like. You might end up being a sex slave in a sense to where you're actually making more people. You know what I'm saying? So it's a complete flip. Like,
and you're making more people for the other people.
Brutality is equal. I'm just saying the mentality is flipped. It's a trip to see.
And you know, that and you know, one of the other things too, because we got a little bit more to go. Because one of the things they touched on that I know a lot of people probably missed, but some people, because we have some sharp people listening, they talked about Mansa Musa. Kingdom of Mali. And you know, we got, you know, all those memes that get passed around about Mansa Musa. Oh, he was the richest man. You know, he was so rich that brother wrote a check and the bank bounced. You know, he broke the whole economy. But they don't talk about how a lot of his wealth was acquired and accumulated. And a lot of the history that's being uncovered is showing you Mansa Musa was the greatest slaver in African continental history for a single individual. No individual on any continent had more slaves or made more money from slavery than he did. And we're talking about somebody that was doing this before the Europeans got involved, well over 100 years before they got involved. This is he was involved in what aspect? Because there's no transatlantic slave trade during his reign, but there is a trans-Saharan slave trade. So yeah, he got rich off salt and gold and all these other things, but who was mining the gold? Who were mining the riches? And who was he also selling and using as commodities? Slaves. Mali Empire takes over after the Ghanaian Empire falls, and they fill in the gap. And so while we oftentimes talk about a lot of the history in that part of the world, such as how Timbuktu was well established and things of this sort, there's a lot of things that people don't want to know or they're completely unaware of. Again, and it creates this where we start to, again, romanticize this idea of this perfect utopia called Africa, where everything was black and great and wonderful. And you had a greater chance of probably becoming a slave in Africa than you did in Europe at that time.
Facts. Super facts. And you might end up farther away. Like my J was saying on one of those videos, like people going as far away as India. I mean, they're going as far away as Baghdad and India. Like Baghdad. There's a story of a slave going from East Africa to Japan, fam.
Yeah, well, I mean, what's his name? I'm trying to think of his name.
Sasuke, yeah, you got it.
Yeah, Sasuke, yeah, the black samurai.
Mm-hmm.
How did he end up in Japan? You know, he didn't book a Royal Caribbean cruise there.
Yeah, exactly.
He didn't catch a train. He caught a boat against his will. He was sold to the Japanese, by Christians, in fact.
Everybody's saying it's Yasuke. Okay, that's what's up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Yasuke. Yeah. And so like I say, everybody's hands are dirty. Facts. In this regard, and Sean, so Aerospike, his name is Yasuke. 16th century Aerospike, and then he converted to Islam. And it's interesting, because like I said, you look at how far, there's no corner of the earth where people have lived where slavery hasn't reached.
Facts.
And that's just the history of humanity. And so when we tell the story of the human family, we got to tell the whole thing. We can't just tell the parts that we like, and again, this is to give people truth so they can put things in perspective and so that they can really not have this one particular or biased view of things. Because if we're going to see things because the Lord, when he looks at us, he doesn't look at it and say, well, the black man, the white man, he don't look at it like that. Mm-hmm. He look at these folks, these people. When he wiped out the earth with the flood, he didn't care what color the people were. He said, y'all all got to go. When he destroys the world with fire, he's not going to care about that. That stuff that we care about, and in the grand scheme of things, is really a petty concern. One thing I will say that I've learned since, listening to a lot of you all in Yap Gang and different ones like yourself, Sean, Kedrick, and others, and going through, looking at genetics and dealing with DNA and things of this sort, it starts to dwindle away your obsession with race. When I was going through my testing to see if I had this genetic disorder that runs in my family, I noticed that my geneticist, the way she looked at me, and I even asked her about it, she just looked at me as a human being with a bunch of different genes that made me who I was. She didn't care if I was black, white, none of that was her concern. And it started to make me really think to myself, wow, there's something more, a lot deeper here that I think that we're missing. And again, because of the corruption of sin and because of all these various things that we have in our world today, we fail to see things the way that the Lord does, because we're looking at it through a corrupted lens, and we're looking at it through the corrupt institutions of humanity. And slavery is one of the biggest ones, if not the biggest. You know, if not the biggest. So I'm going to play. You got anything else you want to add, man? Because I'm going to play the video about the Trans-Saharan slave route itself. And then we're going to play that one video that you like, where he gives us the history of the Arab or Trans-Saharan slave trade.
Yeah, I'm going to circle back real quick about Mansa Musa and whatnot, because a lot of people know him for like the gold trade and whatnot. Like you're talking about like getting rich off of gold and salt and whatnot. And a lot of people don't understand that like the Mali Empire, it ruled over other smaller kingdoms and whatnot. That's what like an empire is. It's multiple kingdoms that are kind of put together and whatnot, with somebody running that thing and whatnot. And so something that was common amongst the Muslims and whatnot was them actually charging people like a tithe of whatever they were producing and whatnot. So you were getting people getting charged a tithe of the salt of their salt mines and whatnot. People getting charged a tithe of their gold and whatnot. And so this is something that you see a lot of the Christian urban apologists and whatnot running with is the fact that like the Islamic sources talk about that when Mansa Musa was like in Egypt or whatnot, he was getting asked like, what's up with your gold and whatnot. He basically said, I get it from the kingdom of Takrur, where the Christians are. And so he was getting it like as like a tax off them. It wasn't like their main thing in Mali whatnot. So like in Mali, their thing was slavery whatnot. You know what I'm saying? That's how they made their bread. Right?
Yeah.
But the question is like, so how did I used to think the same thing. Like I used to have like a romanticized version of like Ethiopian Christianity, friends. Like, oh, like they never dealt with slavery. They had nothing to do with our West African slavery, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then I got into the same Islamic sources, right? Then I found out, I was like, wow, them cats was always all in West Africa, all in North Africa, like again, there for the trade and whatnot, right? And so what were they trading? What were they getting back? Like, no, there was people involved. There was slavery involved, right?
Right.
And so like that's one of the ways that's one of the ways how Christianity got to West Africa prior to colonialism was the slave trade. And that's, it just is what it is with that. You know what I'm saying? And so everybody's hands is dirty in this thing, right? Everybody's hands is dirty.
And, you know, Thursday, we're going to get into Ethiopia and a little bit more the Eastern African countries' involvement, because, again, Ethiopia is no utopia either.
No.
While they have a grand history, not being conquered and not being colonized, they also were involved in the slave trade too, just like the other countries. And they were a Christian. And what makes them stand out is they were the only Christian empire not conquered by the Arabs in that part of the world, but they still participated in trading slaves with the Arab nations or empires around them.
Right there with them, yeah.
You know, and so that's going to be key, something that we got to bring up again, because, like I said, we see it's too much bad information being circulated. So I'm going to show this next video here just so we understand what the Trans-Saharan trade route was. I was contemplating between, because I have a short version and a long version. I think because of the time, I'm going to play the short version and I play the long version on Thursday. And then I'm going to go right into another video, the Indian Ocean slave trade, which is actually the Arab slave trade, and one other right after that. All right.
The Trans-Saharan trade was a network of trade routes that connected sub-Saharan Africa with the Mediterranean world from the 8th century to the 16th century. This trade route was one of the most significant cultural and economic interactions in world history. It was a critical source of wealth for West Africa and a significant factor in the growth of the Islamic religion in the region. The Trans-Saharan trade played a vital role in shaping the cultures and economies of both North and West Africa. The Trans-Saharan trade began in the 8th century when Arab and Berber merchants began to cross the Sahara Desert in search of gold, slaves, and other valuable goods. The trade route stretched from the Mediterranean coast to the Sahel region of West Africa, covering over 6,000 kilometers. Merchants traveled in caravans that could consist of up to 10,000 camels, horses, and donkeys. These caravans were necessary to transport goods across the vast expanse of the Sahara Desert. The Trans-Saharan trade was driven by the demand for gold, which was abundant in West Africa. Gold was highly valued in the Islamic world, where it was used to make coins and jewelry. The trade also involved the exchange of other valuable goods, such as ivory, slaves, salt, and textiles. The trade was facilitated by the growth of Islam in North Africa, which provided a common language and religion for traders. The trade routes of the Trans-Saharan trade were diverse and complex, and they changed over time. The routes varied depending on the political and economic conditions of the region. Some routes followed the Niger River, while others followed the western coast of Africa. The most important trade cities were located in the Sahel region, including Timbuktu, Gao, and Jen. The city of Timbuktu was a significant center of trade and learning in West Africa. It was a hub for the trade of gold, salt, and other goods, and it was also home to some of the world's oldest universities. These universities were centers of Islamic learning, where scholars from across the Islamic world came to study and teach. The Trans-Saharan trade had a significant impact on the cultures and economies of West and North Africa. It facilitated the spread of Islam throughout the region and helped to create a cultural and intellectual exchange between West Africa and the Islamic world. It also helped to create a rich and diverse cultural heritage in the region, which is still celebrated today. The trade was not without its risks. The harsh conditions of the Sahara Desert made travel difficult, and caravans were often attacked by bandits and raiders. The trade also led to the enslavement of many Africans, who were captured and sold into slavery. Despite these risks, the trade continued to thrive for centuries. The Trans-Saharan trade declined in the 16th century with the arrival of European traders and the development of sea trade routes. European traders were able to offer goods at lower prices than the Arab and Berber merchants, and they were also able to offer new and exotic goods, such as spices and silk. This led to a decline in the demand for goods from West Africa, and the trade routes of the Trans-Saharan trade gradually fell into disuse. Today, the legacy of the Trans-Saharan trade can still be seen in the cultures and economies of West and North Africa. The trade played a critical role in shaping the region's history and creating a cultural exchange between Africa and the Islamic world. It also helped to create a rich and diverse cultural heritage in the region, which is still celebrated today.
Slaves in Istanbul were people of many different races. Skin color did not mark a person as free or enslaved. As a result, the descendants of those enslaved within the Ottoman Empire, unlike the descendants of enslaved Africans, have not faced centuries of racism and discrimination. The trafficking of Africans into slavery began much further back in time than many people realize, with enslaved people shipped not across the Atlantic Ocean, but the Indian Ocean instead.
The Indian Ocean slave trade is probably the oldest of the slave trades and transported more human beings, and it was multi-directional.
Exports of the enslaved from the Indian Ocean to the Muslim world grew exponentially after Arab traders won control of the Swahili coast and sea routes in the 8th century. The trafficking of millions of human beings from Africa's east coast led to the emergence of African diaspora communities like the Shidis in Pakistan and India and the Afro-Iraqis in Basra.
Islamic law does not permit slave trading. Many Muslims throughout the Indian Ocean world ignored those rules, and so they plundered and captured Africans, Indians, Southeast Asians, usually non-Muslims.
Both Christianity and Islam asserted the value of a person as created by God. Yet adherents to both faiths accepted the capture, sale, and ownership of men, women, and children from Africa. The Atlantic trade to the west centered on labor and shipped at least 2 men for every woman. The Indian Ocean trade to the east centered on services and included soldiers, cooks, and concubines. It shipped roughly 2 women for every man.
The hub of this trade was in modern-day Tanzania, under control of the Omani Arab Empire from the 17th century. For 200 years, it specialized in three things: ivory, spices, and slaves. By 1807, Britain had finally turned its back on the slave trade. Naval warships were dispatched to suppress the slave trades of other nations, leading the British Royal Navy into the Indian Ocean and into direct contact with the slave traders of Zanzibar.
So there you see that video. Pretty interesting, huh? Pretty interesting history that we have here. And I know more. I know you said you might have to dip out. So if you have to go, I understand, because I see the time is up on you. I only got one more thing that I'm gonna show anyway, because the rest of what I have, we can show that on Thursday. But did you want to add
real
something?
quick?
Go ahead.
Real quick before I jump off, I might have you replay that one on Thursday because there's a lot of cities and towns there that I'll be able to show sources for that have like Jewish populations, et cetera, whatnot. But at the same point in time, we'll be able to clear up a lot of perceptions on exactly how Jews were targeted in the trades and whatnot. Because something I think people need to understand, and I'll leave it here, is at the end of the day, a bitter pill we're going to have to swallow is that so-called Black Muslims, Christians, and Jews within Africa were involved in trading slaves throughout the Sahara.
Right.
Before a European ever showed up. Before they ever showed up.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's a bitter pill, one of them big horse pills, the ones they give you, when you go to the hospital, they give you that Motrin, that 800 milligram. It's a big one.
Yeah. You're gonna hear me talk a lot about like West African Christian culture and other cultures like that before colonialism on my channel and whatnot, right? That's something I focus on quite a bit, but something we have to really understand and accept as reality and whatnot, and kind of let go in a sense, right? Like Dean does with racism. We got to do this too, right? Is understand that West African Christians, Muslims, Jews, and the African spiritual traditions and whatnot were all involved in slavery before Europeans showed up and whatnot, right? So
yeah,
we gotta this is one of the situations where when we're sitting there pointing a finger, we got three coming back at us, right? Literally, if not more, right? So that's something we gotta really stew and think about it and think about the implications thereof and whatnot, right? And again, like I was saying, comparing and contrasting, like we can't act like the transatlantic slave trade was the most brutal slave trade in the history of the game. Like if nothing else, it was on par with what was going on in Africa, right?
Right.
If nothing else. But with that, I appreciate you, brother man, for letting me come on and to give my commentary, because this is a fantastic topic to get into, and I can't wait to get to talk about it again on Thursday, whatnot. These are some great clips, fam. Great clips, fam. Watch this thing again. Get your pen and your pad out and whatnot, because there's a lot of information in these clips that are being shown. But with that, fam, shout out to the chat, and shout out to you, brother Blacktastic, whatnot. Peace and love.
All right, my brother. Shalom. All right, you all. So I got one more video that I want to show. And like I said, Europeans weren't the first to practice racism, but they were the first to create a system based on it, from which we get the system that we know as white supremacy, which enabled them, or which they used to dominate the world. And you had the earlier version of that was called Manifest Destiny. And it's interesting because you can trace this kind of thinking or ideology even going all the way back to the Crusades, when the Crusaders would go into these other lands and they would say, God wills it. In other words, everything that they did was sanctioned by God, as long as it was against who they considered to be the enemies of God. And so people also enslaved people with that same type of philosophy. Like I said, once you devalue a person, and you minimize them as a human being and don't see them as equal to yourself, it makes it easier for people to justify their brutality against them. And believe it or not, but I want you to think about this for a moment. That same type of stinking thinking has infiltrated our communities here in the United States and other parts of the world, which is why we see so much of the violence amongst us in our communities, because look at what it's based on. And I'm talking about, you look at things like gang violence. And I've talked about this before on this platform. This kind of thing I address in the community. Look at that mentality. All of these things have a genesis or a beginning, so to speak, that you can attach or trace to something. And it's all, again, connected to the sins of mankind. But look at how we devalue one another in our own communities. If a woman is a bitch or a hoe, she's not a woman anymore. She's barely even human. So you can abuse her, misuse her, and accuse her unjustly and mistreat her. And then we wonder why we have so many problems in many of our relationships. If a man is a mark or a punk or just a nigga and he ain't even a man anymore, he's ops. He's, blood, crip, gangster, vice lord. We're all these things, but what God made us to be. And the less value you put on us, or the more value you take away from someone, rather, the easier it is now to eliminate that person. And that's why people can go out here and murder and kill each other with these kind of names, or using these kind of names and terminology for one another, because we don't see each other the same as we see ourselves. When you get people out here teaching false doctrine, calling people the descendants of beasts and aliens and demon hybrids and things of this sort, you make them more evil, so evil that you now minimize or eliminate your evil. But yet everyone's being judged for sin. You can end up in the same place that the devil himself is going because of sin, the lake of fire. So what's the difference? Why all the demarcation? But see, these things that we now have in our society that work on our psychology is a result of the corruption of humanity. And one of the biggest contributors to this is slavery. The desire or will to dominate another person. And like I said earlier, going back to Genesis, that was not what we were told to do. The first thing the Lord told humanity to do was dominate the earth, have dominion over all the creation, not over each other. Not over each other, And I see Fuller said, could definitely say they got some inspiration in that regard from the Romans. Well, the Romans were inspired by those who came before them. The Greeks were slavers. A lot of Roman society is taken from the Greeks. The Etruscans, who were the culture in Italy or on that peninsula before Rome became an empire. They were debauched people who practiced all kinds of lascivious lifestyles like we see in America today and in other parts of Europe, with all of the trans stuff and all of the other kind of stuff. Yeah, the whole thing, they had all of that back then before. But then you look at the brutality of slavery and the history of it. Well, we see in the Bible, Egypt was a brutal slaver, but so were the Assyrians, so were the Babylonians, and so on and so on and so forth. The further back you go in history, the more other places on the world that you look at, you're going to find it there. My brother Aerospike had brought up earlier the Incas right here in the Americas, the Aztecs, the Mayans. They were all slavers. Native Americans practiced slavery. They weren't just worshiping the great buffalo spirit and looking for the flying eagle. They did the same things here as well. You even had Indians who kept black slaves and fought for the Confederacy. So we have all these things. So this last video I'm going to show is going to be about a gentleman that a lot of people don't know about, but his name is Tipple Tip. Tipple Tip is the poster child for what I would call a sellout, a coon, a Sambo, or whatever, all those names that you can think of. This is definitely Tipple Tip in terms of the damage and destruction that he did to his people. If Mansa Musa was the single greatest enslaver in Africa in their history, then Tipple Tip was the second, and he wasn't a king like Mansa Musa. And he's a lot more recent in history to where they have photos of him. So that tells you this wasn't that long ago. And then we're going to do a more longer presentation, but this one's about 2 minutes. So you're going to learn 10 facts about Tipple Tip. Fair use.
Tippu Tip, which translates to the gatherer together of wealth, was an Arab slave trader who made himself very wealthy in the internal slave trade and ivory trading business. He specialized in traveling to the interior of Africa, buying and capturing slaves. He stuck terror into the hearts of chiefs and villagers, compelling them to hand over tasks and slaves in exchange for their lives. The fact that he walked around with guns made him all the more believable. In his time, the ivory trade was booming. Tippu Tip led many trading expeditions into Central Africa, constructing profitable trading posts deep into the region. It is commonly thought that he was nicknamed Tippu Tip after the tip-tip sound that his guns gave off during his expeditions into the interior. He used the many slaves he captured to carry ivory to the coast, after which he would sell some of the slaves. Some of the slaves he would use to carry the supplies back to the interior. Tippu Tip built a trading empire, using the profits to establish clove plantations on Zanzibar. By 1895, he had acquired 7 shamba, or plantations, and numerous slaves. He met and helped several famous Westerners, so-called explorers of the African continent, like David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley. The Berlin Conference interrupted Tippu Tip's so-called successful slave trade, and relations between Arab traders and Europeans rapidly deteriorated. Tippu Tip died in 1905, a vastly wealthy man, albeit with blood on his hands. The story of Tippu Tip reminds me that Africa will never truly be free until we deal with the sellouts in our midst. What do you think? Please support my channel by liking this video. Till next time.
Yep, and there's Tipple Tip. The story of Tipple Tip. And Tipple Tip also had ties to King Leopold, the Belgian king, who exterminated millions of Africans. And that's why I called him, he's the poster child for sellouts. And it's a sad part in the history, again, of both Africa, of Black people, and of the world. But these kind of great evils oftentimes are led by people who unfortunately resemble and look like us oftentimes. And you notice in the presentation, she called him an Arab. And earlier presenters had let us know that the term Arab didn't always necessarily mean somebody who was Saudi Arabian. And so, because we know we have Arabs in Sudan and other places like that of Africa, but it's a cultural designation as much as it is a nationalistic or ethnic type of designation as well. Exodus chapter 21, verse 16, real quick, tells us this: whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death. This is what it says in the scriptures. On Thursday, when we do part 2, we're going to get more into the scriptures, and we're going to relate a lot of these things back to the Bible and see what the Word of God has to say about it. We're also going to put up, show some things, some graphs or charts that will give us some express differences between the transatlantic slave trade and the trans-Saharan slave trade, as well as tell us how they were alike. And we even have more history coming relative to the trans-Saharan slave trade. So we're going to take a look at these things, and we'll also discuss in further detail the dispersion of biblical Israel through the trans-Saharan slave trade. All right. And I think that'll be pretty interesting and eye-opening for those of us who tune in on this Thursday. All right. And Brother Moore will be back with us for the entire time, because I know he had to leave early from us today. So, as always, we're not always right. and others aren't always wrong. So that means we're always learning, and we should always be willing to be corrected when we get information wrong, so that way we can get it right. Yeshua reminds us in St. John chapter 5:39, as he upbraided the Pharisees, but yet is written for our learning, search the scriptures, for in them you think ye have eternal life, and they are they which testify of me. Even when we do historical presentations like this, we can always tie it back to scripture or some principles that we've learned from the scriptures, because it has to do with our living. We don't want to repeat the same mistakes of the past. So it's necessary that we sometimes study the history of humanity and then look at that in contrast and comparison to the will of Yah to see where we've gone wrong so that we know how to get it right. Acts chapter 17, verse number 11 reminds us to have that good Bible study habit. It says, now these Jews or Yahudim were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. And I pray that you do the same with the information you heard here, receiving it with eagerness and then examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. I'll give it a little bit of homework for those of you who are interested. Study Exodus chapter 21 before Thursday. Take a good look at it. Don't just simply read it, but actually investigate it, study it, break down the words, find out what does slave mean? What does it mean to steal? You know, what are these different words and things of this sort, so that we can understand the proper context that is being used in the scripture, and what else was, created as a result of these laws. Why were these things put in the Torah? For the nation of Israel, what was going on at that time in the history of the world. So you want to take a look at those things. So until the next time, beloved, as always, I pray nothing but the best for the blessed. And truly, you are the blessed of the Most High, the apple of his eye. He's absolutely crazy about you with an everlasting love. And I love you too, just not as much as he, because he can do more for you than I can. All right. And so, Jacqueline, I see you asked a question here. She said that would be an Ishmaelite, right? Our cousin. You talking about Tipple Tip? He could be. Thursday, Jacqueline, I think you want to definitely tune in, because we got some, I guess I consider explosive information too, because what we're going to find out is that not only was some of our cousins selling us, but some of our very brethren were selling us, because we had some Israelites that would have been considered Arab, not so much by lineage, but by cultural affiliation and association, because they had converted to another out of their culture, and they basically had become Arabs in that regard, and they were very active in the slave trade, even in selling their own people. And so we're going to take a look at it. All right. And like I said, we're going to keep trying to bring out this history and this truth, because we want to see things correctly, even if it's the ugly or inconvenient truth. All right. And I totally agree with you. When we are taught about our culture, which is something we have lost, we will be better focused on righteousness. Indeed. And that's why we got to go back to the scriptures, because that's the constitution for our culture. So until the next time, beloved, shalom.